I was just feeling a little bit homesick. So I got really excited about that, and I came back and did the audition, hoping that I'd win, because I moved my whole life to Australia the week before the audition.
I am so glad to bring you today's conversation with somebody that I've been following along with for the last few years. I find her really inspiring, and I've been wanting to have her on the podcast, and now she's on the podcast. I'm Jason Neath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting today with Phoebe Russell, who is the principal bassist of the Queensland Symphony Orchestra in Australia. She joined that orchestra in 2017, and we talk about her journey there. And she's originally from Melbourne, Australia, and has done so much in her career already. It's really quite impressive. Sub with so many orchestras: Berlin Philharmonic, Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra, the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, Netherlands Philharmonic. She studied at the Berlin Academy, the Karajan Academy, and we talk about that. We talk about Gary Karr and the time she spent with him. Also about the Women in Bass concert featuring double bass women from Australia and New Zealand, and many more topics. I know you'll love this conversation. And quick shout out before we get rolling here to our sponsors: D'Addario Strings, Upton Bass, Steve Swan String Bass, Bass Violin Shop, and Colstein Music. More on them later, but let's dig into this conversation. Oh, and by the way, there is a great video that you have to see of Phoebe on two-step violin, one of my favorite YouTube channels. We got that linked up, so definitely check that out and everything else she's up to in the show notes. And let's get into our conversation with Phoebe Russell. You grew up in Melbourne, is that right?
Yes, I grew up in Melbourne.
Okay, tell me about your early years. Did you start on bass? What were your first musical experiences?
So I started playing the piano when I was really little, like really 3 or 4 years old. It wasn't serious, but my parents were pretty keen to get me into music. They weren't musicians, but they read a lot of articles about how, the effects on brain development and productivity, and they both really loved music. And then when I was about 8 years old at school, we had a school string program, and everybody got to choose an instrument, which is a really great initiative that's becoming really popular here now. And I really, really wanted to play the harp. I thought it was the most elegant, feminine, beautiful instrument in the world. And I was really devastated to find out that actually the harp wasn't included in the string instrument program. They told me that the double bass was quite similar because of the size, I'm guessing, and I got to do an arm wrestle with a few boys, and I won, so I felt really proud about that, and I was awarded the double bass, which was a little bit of a shock to someone that was expecting a harp, but I learned to love it. Yeah.
Wow,
so
that's so super cool. That harp was your initial kind of. I right in the room next to me, I have a harp because my wife's a harpist, and
what? I had no idea.
Yeah, and there are a lot of harp and bass couples I've met over the years. It seems like a fairly common. Yeah.
I've been talking to recently, like in the last, because I did an interview about this 2 years ago and mentioned the harp, and ever since then, so many female bass players have come to me and said, "Oh, that was exactly my story. Like, so many of us wanted to play the harp, and somehow ended up with the bass." I mean, I'm truly happy with the choice now.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure. So were you taking lessons in those early years, or just playing in your school orchestra, or how did that all play? Because I know you ended up being in the Melbourne Youth Symphony and playing in some other orchestras in Melbourne, right? Like how did that all develop for you?
Yeah, well, I didn't have lessons per se for the first couple of years. It was just within the program, and like we had little group classes. But when I was about 11 or 12, I started having proper lessons with a bass teacher, and she tutored at the youth orchestra programs. So I started getting into that, when I was about 10 or 11. And I remember I had absolutely no idea how to read music. And I would sit in those summer camps. And I remember I went through a whole week without anyone noticing. Obviously, all the strings could play, and I had no idea what was going on, and no one ever worked it out. I think the beauty of being a bass player.
Oh, that's awesome. Did you start on German bow? Is German bow like the most popular bow in Melbourne, or is it kind of varied? How does that work there?
It's very varied,
Okay.
actually. I started on French bow just because that was the one that was at school. But then I actually had a lot of thumb pain. I mean, definitely from bad technique, and my teacher happened to be a German bow player. So I switched for that reason. And in Australia, yeah, in Sydney, it's mainly French bow. Brisbane, probably mainly German bow. Melbourne, half. It's very mixed.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I'm a French bow player myself, kind of an amateur German bow player, and it's the whole German bow world is fascinating to me. Like I went to Spain, northwestern Spain. Streicher was huge there, and like he had a major influence. So all these students were holding their German bow with that. Is it free thumb, or it's like a slightly different approach, like the first finger a bit over the stick, and even holding the bass a little more Streicher-ish. It's really that I find the German bow world a bit mysterious but fascinating, and I love practicing with it. I keep telling myself I'm going to buy a German bow and actually get good at using it.
Well, I think Streicher was a really big influence all over the world. In Australia, I was just thinking in our section in the Queensland Symphony Orchestra, the majority of the players play with Streicher technique. My predecessor studied with Streicher and then taught all the students with the Streicher technique. And one of my colleagues studied with Streicher in Vienna. So it's kind of it's kind of a predominantly Streicher country almost. So there's the half German and half French, but yeah, he made big waves.
Yeah, it's interesting. We must not have gotten as many players like that, at least in the areas of the United States I've lived, because I see that technique much less frequently in Chicago or now here in San Francisco. Yeah. So take me on the path to Berlin. How did you discover that program, and just how did that journey unfold for you?
So it's actually a funny story. I was thinking about this when you asked me to do the interview. When I was a teenager, I was looking up online where I should go and study, and I had no idea, but I wanted to know what was, I guess, the best or most interesting place to go. And I came across your blog, and someone was talking about the Karajan Academy, and that's how I found out about it on jasonheath.com.
Oh my goodness, it's a small world.
Yeah, so I said to my teacher, like, oh, I've heard about this academy. You get to play with the Berlin Phil and get lessons, and that's basically where it started. And I didn't, obviously a young girl in Australia, I didn't really know if I had a chance, but he really told me to go for it. And I just went over to Berlin to do the audition 2012, beginning of 2012. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What is that program like? Because you were at it's the Orchestra Academy, right? For the Berlin Philharmonic. Is that the program?
Yeah, that's what it's called. It's really, really, it's a very unique program. It's called Karajan Academy because it was kind of an initiative started by Karajan, and I can never say that well. But it's gone on to be copied by a lot of orchestras in Germany, which is great. So basically, you get to have weekly lessons with a mentor in the section, or various mentors in the section. And there's a group of academists, 2 from each instrument generally, besides the harp. And there are like academy concerts and academy recitals. So we do a lot of chamber music together. And on top of that, you're basically first on the list for the casual employee, or subbing, I think you say, with the Berlin Philharmonic. So you play there 2 or 3 weeks out of the month, and then do a lot of chamber music and get lessons.
So what's it like playing with the Berlin Philharmonic? That's like one of my all-time favorite orchestras, and I like so many people subscribed to the digital concert hall for a few years, and my wife and I would sit down and watch like Tchaikovsky 5, instead of watching a movie, and it's just like I've been fascinated by that orchestra. I almost took one of my student orchestras on a trip to Berlin just to see the Berlin Philharmonic and to see that fascinating hall. So like, what's that experience like playing with that group?
I mean, clearly it's amazing. But I think one thing that struck me the most playing there, especially for the first time, was the way that the orchestra they work almost like a living organism, you know, regardless of who's standing out the front. They just, it's like a well-oiled machine, you know, like if you don't know how they're going to play, like they all know what they're going to do. They all kind of sense each other, especially in the bass group. There's this kind of, I guess, I mean, machine-like isn't really a great way of putting it, but there's this, it just happens, you know, like regardless of where the beat goes down, the section know where they're going to play. And I think I was pretty scared about it the first time I played there, because watching those German conductors, you know, I mean, it's really different from what we're used to here, and obviously in the US, kind of that they almost just kind of do brush strokes and put the beat down, and the orchestra doesn't play until they're on the second or third beat, you know, they're already bowing before the orchestra's playing. So yeah, so I guess you get used to it, but it's really cool sitting in the middle of a group that just have only one sense of, you know, how it's going to happen.
What's it like playing in that hall?
Oh, the whole, I mean, I think that's almost the most incredible part of it, is such an awesome concert hall. And acoustically, I mean, anywhere you sit in the hall behind the orchestra, way up high, it sounds great. And it's beautiful to play in.
It's such a fascinating hall to me, and I think if I'm right, isn't the conductor kind of actually in the center of the hall, like the way the hall is positioned? Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, so the audience surround the orchestra, exactly. So and even like when there's no choir singing, some of the audience members are allowed to come and sit on stage behind the percussion section, which is super cool. I used to do that before I got to play there.
We had a very mild version of that in Chicago, the orchestra hall in Chicago, and and the audience would be very close to the bass section, and I always remember being very self-conscious about what I had written in my part. I was trying to make sure not to put anything inappropriate, you know, for the audience to see. It's interesting. I remember watching on that digital concert hall, I think they were talking about just how they set up this just incredible camera setup, you know, for all the performances. And it's almost as if because I think the hall's from the 60s, if I remember right, or something like, or maybe late
1963. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so but it's almost as if they somehow knew that they were going to be doing something like that. There was like actually the space in the hall to kind of put the control room that's now there. It's just very, very interesting that it was, you know, probably without anybody intending to do that, it was like the perfect thing for this like camera setup that they have now.
Well, I guess Karajan was really he was kind of ahead of his time with the whole videoing and photography thing. He was really you know, he put the orchestra out there a lot and put himself out there, and they were already doing film way back then. Actually, I saw one video that he'd done, and apparently there was, I don't know if this is true, but apparently there was a call with the orchestra, and then there was a call of just him alone, so he could get perfect shots of himself. And in the audience, there was just paper cutouts, but it may not be true.
I would not doubt that at all. I one of my favorite things, one of those digital concert hall extras was like Karajan for some operatic production. So he was conducting, and he was also the stage director. And so he was like conducting the orchestra, and then he stops and he jumps up on the stage and he like grabs the sword from the singer and shows like how to swing the sword the way he wants it. It's just this like, sort of preposterous but kind of amazing thing as well.
Quite a man.
So Jana Saksala and Matthew McDonald are the co-principals of that orchestra, right? Am I?
Yeah.
Okay. So 20 years ago, actually 21 years ago, I had the chance to work with Saksala in Germany in the Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival. And I remember him demonstrating all these like amazing German bow spiccato techniques, this sort of like helicopter sound. And then I remember talking with Matthew McDonald about like just the how profoundly different. Maybe those aren't his exact words, but just like the approach to sound, like you were talking about, with like very different from what we have here in the States, for example, you know, like with all the bow and like starting the note. And Matthew was just talking about how different that approach was to what he'd experienced prior to, you know, studying in Berlin. Like, did your bowing technique change at all when you went to Berlin? How did that work for you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When I went to Berlin, I changed everything about my bow grip. I think there, like, I'd say the most important thing in an audition or when playing in a section is the sound quality. You know, rather than anything else, it's all about the right hand. And I guess it's like, I remember a lot of teachers said to me, it's not about the beginning of the note. I mean, yeah, obviously the beginning has to be beautiful, but it's about the ends of the notes. So they play, I guess, with a lot of resonance, a really warm attack, and a lot of kind of follow through with the sound. So it's always ringing, which, yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to do it. But if in that section, everyone kind of has this beautiful, warm sound that meshes together because it's so similar.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see, and it's just such a different but compelling and beautiful approach. And so is that this episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. Did you know that you can tell the difference between D'Addario strings by the silking? Peg and silking denotes pitch and tension. So E is green, A is black, D is yellow, and G is red. C, by the way, is purple if you have a C string. A thin band of yellow just before the metal winding denotes light tension, and a thin orange band of silking denotes heavy tension. Ball end silking, that's the stuff down by the tailpiece, denotes string family like Kaplan, Helicore, or Zyx. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. How is it that Upton Bass came to design a bass for Gary Karr? Well, it all started with an email. Here's Eric and Gary from Upton Bass on how this happened.
Gary was at kind of the forefront of ergonomics in commissioning different bass makers to make ergonomic models to his playing style. And he basically replied. And he said, yeah, but you know, here's what I'm looking for. I want something, you know, that's this, and this.
He sent us sketches.
Oh, and by the way, I want it affordable that anyone going to my car camp could afford it.
This model has become so popular, and Gary Karr even played it for the 50th anniversary International Society of Bassists convention. He was the opening, he gave the keynote speech, and he played two beautiful selections on his Upton Bass, his Karr model Upton Bass. Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. They proudly offer the largest variety of fine basses and bows in the Southeast. You can find something at every price point by makers such as Thomas Martin, Bill Lakeberg, Romano Solano, Lemur Music, all Shen models, K, Epiphone, and bows by Louis Morizot, Fuchs, Nürnbergo, Arcos Brazil, and others. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com, and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram. So we have all sorts of different people that listen to this podcast, but we have a lot of students and adult amateurs and people trying to like figure out new techniques or new ways of pulling out sound. Like, what did you do to develop that? Like, did you practice scales? Did you record yourself? Did you just take lessons? Or like, what were some things that you did to develop that kind of specific Berlin approach?
I mean, I spent a lot of time sitting in the practice room. I can't deny it. You know, you can't replace hard work with anything. I spent a lot of time, open strings for sure. I mean, I'm a huge fan of technique. Not everyone in Germany is. Like, a lot of them just incorporate this stuff into their playing by practicing excerpts and different things. But I guess I spent a lot of time with open strings, really slow scales, and then, I mean, I think it's all kind of, it's kind of, you just have to know what you're looking for, so I often practice kind of playing and then stopping and hoping that the last note that I played would just keep ringing, So I think there's no substitute for playing with the orchestra, So I mean, obviously you can do what you can, but that kind of real experience. So for me, like when I was playing in the section, I just watched and listened and tried to copy exactly what my desk partner was doing, match every single bow stroke. And I was really lucky to get to study with Yanni Saksala, and he would often give me a lesson before a project, and then in the orchestra he'd kind of look down and be like, kind of correct what I was doing, give me a few pieces of advice. So it was almost like an interactive lesson 5 days of the week.
Wow. So you mentioned that you're a fan of technique.
Yeah.
And I would, as am I, and many people listen. I'd love to know, like, what does technique or technical practice look like for you? Do you have like a specific routine you go through every day, or things that you rotate through, or what does that look like, and maybe how has that evolved over the past few years?
Well, I've always been, I've always just really enjoyed kind of warming into the day with technique, and not many of my teachers really like pushed me to do it or did it themselves. I mean, they're all great players, but it wasn't really their thing. But I think for me, I always start the day with really long open strings, just to wake up. I'm not a morning person. And then really, really slow scales. So I'll put the metronome on 64 beats per note and just try to get an even sound from frog to tip. And then obviously slurred 2 notes, 3 notes, all the way up to 12 notes, trying to get consistency through the bow. And then I actually make up a lot of my exercises. Like I started doing it with my students. I have a technique class at the Conservatorium in Brisbane where I teach. And I started kind of looking at issues that they had and finding ways to, get over them. So I do that for myself. Whatever I'm working on or whatever I feel on the day that I need to work on the most, I'll kind of break up into a little exercise. So I do a lot of different string crossing, spiccato exercises, shifting, vibrato, and then I guess the ones that are a staple in my diet, are the Petrarchy exercises. I love those. I'm a big fan of. I mean, I just look at how he plays today. I went to do a course with him a couple of years ago, and the guy's in his 80s. He kind of looks. You see him and you're like, oh, he seems kind of old and a little bit frail, and then he picks up the bass and it's just he's almost breaking it in half with the strength of his left hand and the huge sound. So ever since that, I've been obsessed with trying to learn how he does that. So I do a lot of Petrarchy exercises from the book as well.
Yeah, I met Petrarchy for the first time this past summer in Lucca for Bass Europe, and he came out and kind of kicked off one of the opening ceremonies, and I've been a fan of that book for years. Do you have any favorite? Do you just go through the book, or do you have any go-to exercises? Like, I know I've always had a couple that I like really dig into, but do you what are your favorites, or like what do you do most consistently out of there, or do you just read the whole thing down?
I wish. No, I haven't learned them all. Probably my favorites would be I don't know what number it is or anything. It's like shifting in blocks. So you've got shifting all the way up the instrument, like in hand position. So I think it's like maybe 2B. I'm not sure.
I know. Then, I know the one you're talking about. Yeah. It's either all half steps or it's like got a whole step in there depending on the scale, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. That's a great one.
So that's a great one to start with because it just kind of solidifies hand positions. Mm-hmm. And then I wish I knew the numbers so I didn't have to sing like an idiot. But starts in an E flat, and you go,
You're singing my favorite exercises. Those are the. It's great. Like, it's interesting because I feel like I need to do something like that too, to just kind of like get things going for the day. And I know Max Dimoff, who's principal bass of the Cleveland Orchestra here, great teacher. He has a similar exercise he calls Max's Magic, and he runs up and down, or just up, I think, all 4 strings. And he basically, by the time he's done, he's played every note there is on the bass, and it's pretty hard. It's pretty hardcore, but if you think about it, it's like, it's kind of a good way to warm up. But okay, so that's awesome. That's a daily thing for you, or regular thing for you. Okay.
Absolutely, definitely daily. Yeah. I remember we used to do that last one at class in Hans Eisler all the time, and yeah. We went to a friend's house, and his partner is not a bass player, and we were having a coffee, and she goes, I'm so sick of that exercise. He goes, da, 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 da. And then in the next room, he started playing. I think it's kind of a cult one, isn't it? She was like, not again.
Oh, yeah. My wife will come out and make fun of the exercises I'm practicing. She'll be like, da, 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 and she'll like make, so I think, all our significant non-bass playing others probably tolerate us and all that. Although you're actually married to a bass player, aren't you?
Yeah, so I'm married to a bass player, which I don't know if it's better or worse. We do lie in bed at night and go through fingerings and bowings sometimes. But yeah, Bernardo, my husband, we met in Berlin, and he's actually really into contemporary music. So he does a lot of kind of crazy, completely different things from me as well, which is cool. So he does a lot of stuff with effects pedals and a lot of improvisation. So yeah, so we're although we both do play in the symphony orchestra, we're quite different.
That's very cool. What a fun combination of interests. And so actually, so take me. There's so many things we can talk about. I'm like, I get distracted easily. But take me from Berlin to where you are now in Australia. Did you just decide to move back to Australia, and then the Queensland job emerged, or did you go specifically for that job, or like how did that work for you?
Yeah. So after I finished in the academy in Berlin, I was freelancing, and actually, my husband and I were both lucky enough to get pretty much contracts with Mahler Chamber Orchestra. So we're doing a lot of traveling, which was really exciting, and playing with a lot of different orchestras. But I guess I'd been in Germany after that for about 5 or 6 years. And I don't know, I mean, it sounds stupid maybe, but the weather was really getting us down. Like, we both come from really sunny countries. Yeah. And so it's not so much moving back. Like, a job came up, and I remember I was sitting in an airport in Germany talking to my teacher, and he was telling me, there's this job that's just opened up. It's a principal job. It's a really great section. And I was just feeling a little bit homesick. So I got really excited about that. And I came back and did the audition, hoping that I'd win, because I moved my whole life to Australia the week before the audition. And then luckily I did win. So that's how it happened. But I have no idea long term what I'm going to do. I feel like I really needed this time, and I'm really enjoying it.
That moving for the weather is not a bad, as somebody who now lives in California, actually probably a somewhat similar in a lot of ways climate. I don't think we're going back. I don't predict us going back to colder climates. So it's
hard.
It's hard, and I've learned. Personally, not in the cold months here in the United States, I try not to post jerky photos of me sitting under the palm trees, which I did the first year. I was like, hey,
I think you've got to do it.
Yeah, I had enough nasty comments on social media. I was like, stop it, Jason. So what's the job like? What's the orchestra like, and what's the schedule like? Just tell me a little bit about the job.
So the Queensland Symphony Orchestra is an opera and ballet, actually. I always forget about that part, and symphony orchestra. So we do a lot of different things. This week we're doing a staged production of John Adams' Flowering Tree, which is really interesting for me. I never really had that much experience doing opera, so that's something that I'm really enjoying. The orchestra, I mean, it's great. It's really, we do a lot of different things. Like I think for this orchestra, what's really special is we do a lot of kind of regional travel to small coastal towns and work with Aboriginals or people that perhaps haven't really been introduced into classical music. So we did an initiative a few months ago, organised by a member of the orchestra, where we went to a small town near Cairns, and he helped just school kids that had never done music before write pieces, like what do you like, and they got to sing in front of a group of musicians from the orchestra. And that sort of stuff is really special, I think, about the orchestra.
So opera as well and ballet as well. So you're doing it all. And that's great that you did the John Adams. So I was playing Nixon in China, and then after that, here or back in Chicago, in the Lyric Opera, they were doing Dr. Atomic, which is a more recent one. Yeah, and I was playing backstage for La Traviata. So they rotate between the operas, and Dr. Atomic has this giant atom bomb as a piece of scenery. And I remember I was under the atom bomb playing Traviata, which is just such a funny, surreal kind of experience.
That's so cool.
Did you know that John Adams, I think his son is a bass player?
Oh, I didn't know that. No.
Yeah.
Okay. That explains the tricky bass lines.
Yeah, it does. And in that Dr. Atomic, there is this huge bass solo, actually. So if you ever get a chance to play that one, it's it's not insanely hard, but it's very prominent, and it's a full page of just bass and some accompaniment.
Right. I was actually curious because we have a couple of bass solis that kind of go right from the bottom of the instrument right up to the top in unison, which is always dangerous in this opera. And I was thinking, what on earth was going through his mind? I mean, we're all sitting here sweating, trying to get it in tune. Yeah. And I was thinking either something awful is happening on stage. No, but yeah, I was curious why he chose so many bits like that, but it makes sense if his son was a bass player.
Yeah, it is definitely he has a high opinion of the bass. As you look through some of those parts, it's crazy. So tell me about that. The was it Women in Bass Day? Is that what it was called, or just tell me about that event?
Yeah, so there was an event in Melbourne about 2 weeks ago. It was called Women in Bass, and actually one of my good friends, Emma Sullivan, a bass player in Melbourne, organised the whole thing. And basically the idea, you can tell from the name, was that bass players all from around New Zealand and Australia, women, got together and we got to share what we do. So there were a lot of different genres. There was a band and there were bass quartets, and there were there was contemporary music, there was romantic music, there was a lot of different things going on, and we finished the day with a double bass orchestra playing David Guetta Titanium. So there was a bit of everything, and the ages ranged from, I think the youngest was aged 8 and the oldest was close to 70. And yeah, I was talking to Ben Puglisi, who's a luthier in Melbourne, about that, and he was saying he thinks that perhaps this was one of the biggest double bass events, female double bass events of this, this concept in the world. I mean, I've never heard of something like that before.
I've never heard of it before either, but I love it. I was following on with the photos, and Ben's a friend, and so it was fun to see. I think he was taking some photos, wasn't he?
Yeah, he took most of the photos, yeah.
One of the great bass players of all time, Fred Zimmerman, former principal bass of the New York Philharmonic. He was Barry Colstein of Colstein Music. He was Barry's bass teacher. Here's Barry on Fred Zimmerman.
Anybody that knew Fred would say he was one of a kind. I mean, the man was probably the most talented, the most giving. He was the most interesting. Not only was he an amazing teacher, I mean, and an amazing performer. He was an amazing artist also. He was truly a great artist.
Along with Fred Zimmerman, people like Milt Hinton, Homer Mensch, Orrin O'Brien, and so many others have had their basses worked on at Colstein's or had instruments made for them by Colstein's. Thank you, Barry, for everything that you've done for the bass world. And folks, check them out at colstein.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. Steve has been active in the bass world and also the guitar world for years. Here's a bit from our live podcast taping with Steve on how he got into that business.
Guitars and basses.
Guitars and basses.
Okay, how did that happen?
They're both helper instruments. I've always played the rhythm guitar, quite often with bass lines moving, either in swing style, jazz style, or country style. Bass is the same thing, supporting the band, the group of people you're playing with. So I've always felt like I was a support person.
I love how Steve describes being a support person, and he is certainly that for the bass community here on the West Coast, here in the San Francisco Bay Area. His shop is located just south of San Francisco, and he has a large retail showroom with about 70 basses on display. And these basses are professional top-of-the-line basses. These basses are student-level basses and everything in between. They're beautifully set up. So if you're looking for a bass or you know someone who is, be sure to check out Steve at steveswanstringbass.com. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast, Steve. It's so great. I'd love to know how it is in Australia. Like here in the States, we have so many female young bass students these days. I mean, my private students, I think over 50% of them are female. And here in San Francisco, when I go around different schools, I mean, it's 50-50 here in San Francisco, or pretty close to 50-50. But of course, and I think this is true worldwide, but certainly in the States, you look at women in professional orchestras, and it is not 50-50. It's certainly not. What does that look like in Australia? Are there a lot of young female bass players in the various cities? And how are things looking just in terms of that?
Yeah, I think in Australia, especially even like, you know, when I was growing up in the youth orchestra, it was always at least 50-50. I remember one, I think it still is so, but I remember one tour we did a Europe tour with the youth orchestra, and Sir Mark Elder was conducting, and he separated us into two sides. You know, there's this kind of technique where there's 4 bass players behind the violins and 4 bass players on the other side behind the cellos. And one side just happened to be 4 women, and the other side happened to be 4 men. So that was a pretty, you know, that was a moment that I realized that. And actually, growing up in Australia, I never really thought, I guess, you know, I can't deny, I mean, obviously sexism, it exists in the world, but I never really thought about it growing up. I never thought like, oh, because I'm a woman, you know, it's different playing the bass, or it's something strange, because there were so many of us. And I also had a female teacher when I was younger, and so it is very even, I guess. But then when you get to the symphony orchestras, it's still not. Yeah. So I think most orchestras in Australia have one woman, which yeah. I'm not really sure how that came about, but I think Emma's event was, I mean, it was amazing, because she called me a few weeks before just to check that I was playing, because she was saying, oh, you know, I don't think anyone's going to come, and I don't know if anyone's going to play. And there were 25 performers on the day, and there were 400 women in the audience.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I think there is a huge community of female bass players.
That's so great. It's so great for all the like. I wish that we had, or hopefully at some point we will have something like that here in the States. But it's so great to have, you know, just be able to like my female bass students. It'd be so great for them to be a part of that and just see that. And you know, I look at, like, my wife's a radiologist, and I look at that career, and we rewind 30 years ago, and it was almost exclusively male. And now you look at all the hospitals, and I mean, it is 50-50 female. And the older generation is still, and I mean, I think things might even move slower in the orchestra world, because people stay in a job for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, but hopefully that trend hopefully the trend is moving in the right direction. But just that's so cool that you did that event, and I'll link up to photos of that, and it's just really inspiring to see.
Yeah, it was an amazing event, and I think the most important thing, like you're saying, is that for the younger girls and the kids, I never, well, none of us ever had events like that, but also a lot of, I guess, not all of, but a lot of the people that I idolized, the bass players I idolized, were men, and the majority of the teachers were men, and the majority of the symphony orchestra bass sections were made up of men. And so, although I didn't necessarily think about that, seeing now that that there are all these wonderful women performing for all these young girls, I think it's something really empowering and quite special.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And it's great to have you out there doing what you do. And I love how well you document what you do on Instagram, for example, or Facebook, and I'll certainly link up to that. But I hope that my young students and other young bass, male and female bassists, but all follow along and see, because it's really cool to see you launching your career. And I wanted to ask about, did you study with Gary Karr for a bit? Did I see that doing my homework?
Yes.
Okay, tell me about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so the first CD I ever bought was called the London Double Bass Sound when I was, I don't know, 11, 12 maybe, and Gary was headlining that, and I used to put it on repeat at home and listen to him playing, all the great hits, I guess, and I absolutely fell in love with him. I think he radiates so much joy for what he does. And I went first to his car camp when I was 15. I think I just turned 15. Yeah, and my mom had to come with me because I don't think they'd had many 15-year-olds there before. But yeah, and I got to have a lesson with him, I guess 3 lessons a week, and we did technique class. Actually, perhaps that's where my love of technique stems from. We had technique class every morning with Gary, and then we did bass quartet concerts and bass orchestra concerts. But the thing that amazed me the most was he did recitals every weekend for us at his house. And I don't think I've ever seen another bass player perform with so much energy, like just as a person. He has so much love for the instrument and so much love for what he does, and I think that's something you can only see live. You can only understand why Gary Karr fans are so excited about him when you've seen him play live. Yeah.
He's just got that. I couldn't agree more. And he's just got like that, just exuding that radiance and that passion and through the music. And he was in Mexico. There's the bass festival in November that Andres Martin organizes, and Gary Karr was the guest this year. Yes. So I got to spend a week with Gary, like a whole bunch of time with Gary, like way more time. I feel so lucky. We were all of this clinicians were remarking on that. Just we were spending like hours a day just hanging out with Gary, and boy, you just listen to the way he is playing and continues to play, and that sound and but just the passion. I mean, it really is inspiring, and that might be very well where you got the technique love from, with his vomit exercises, everybody doing in unison and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think most important what I learned from him is love, and love for everything. He's such a warm person and such a supportive human being. Yeah, and I went back to his course again 2 years later, and then we've kept in touch. I often write and ask him questions, but I'd love to see him again. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's been a while.
Yeah. What so, and you're doing a lot of solo, or you have been doing a fair amount of solo performances over those last few years, right?
Yeah, I have been.
Or orchestra, with orchestra and the like, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the things that I was really keen to do more of when I came back to Australia was play solo. And I've been really lucky to get a lot of chances in the last 2 years playing concertos with orchestras and doing recitals.
What are some of the pieces you've been playing the last couple of years with orchestra or in recital, or what are some of the things you've gotten a chance to do?
I mean, with the orchestra, it's been pretty standard. Bottesini concertos, Van Hal, standard repertoire. A lot of the time, the orchestras kind of approach me and already have an idea of what they want. So but they're both great. They're all all that's a lot of fun to play with orchestra. But I did quite a few recitals in the last year, and I've played Brahms Cello Sonata No. 1, which is one of my favorite pieces to perform. Bottesini Bolero, which is one that I've recently found. Actually, I didn't know it before. Introduction and Bolero, which is, it's got a great mix of fun virtuosic bits, but also singing beautiful melodies. And standard stuff, Glier. And over the last year, I've been working on a few more kind of recent pieces. Like I was practicing a tango concerto by a composer called Joe Kendamo from Melbourne. So I'm trying to broaden my range of repertoire at the moment.
That's cool. Have you explored any, thinking of tango music, have you explored any of Andres Martin's pieces?
No, I haven't actually, but I remember I put a little Piazzolla video online a little while ago while I was preparing for a recital, and someone wrote to me and told me about it. And I think, is that what, excuse me for being a nerd, but I think it's okay with you. Okay. Is that what Joe Conyers is practicing at the moment? I think I heard some bits of some of his music.
That is what Joe's practicing, and yeah, he's just in addition to being one of my favorite people, he's just one of my favorite composers, and so dynamic and exciting. And bringing it back to harp, he's actually writing a series of harp and bass duets that should be coming out soon. Cool. So I'm excited because I get to play them with my wife. But yeah, that's one of the most exciting things about the bass world to me today. Is in addition to we've got our Bottesini, we've got our Van Hal, and we've got our other rep, and then we've got the transcriptions that we're able to explore. But it's really been fun for me these last few years exploring some of these modern composers, and Andres is just a great example. And that music is fun. It's really cool.
Yeah, it looks really, really cool. I'd be really keen to check it out. That can be my new project.
Well, and if you have any influence in any orchestra concerto coming up, his first concerto, wow, is that a cool orchestration? And it is just a blast as a bass player. It's like a rollicking good time, 3 movements, beautiful piece, and it's sort of becoming a modern standard. So that's a fun one to explore for sure.
Okay, that's good to know. I mean, I've heard of the concerto, but I don't really know it that well. So
yeah. Phoebe, this is great. Please let's chat in person in the fall for Rob Nairn's bass day. I think that would be a total blast. I'd love to have you on then and multiple times. I love having people back again and again. I mean, there's so much we could talk about.
Absolutely, yeah.
I have talking about these young students. I have this awesome young female student of mine coming in about 10 minutes who's just the best kind of bass player. She's going to be starting high school next year and is she's just on fire. She's devouring music, working on Dragonetti Concerto. And I usually like to ask with some sort of advice for younger people, but if you could give yourself some advice, maybe those high school years, thinking about heading out to Berlin, or hey, you could talk to my student who's coming right now and give her a bit of advice. But what would you tell yourself or a young bass player, a younger self, or a bass player kind of that age, heading off and starting a career?
I think there's so many things I could say, but I think the most important thing is don't forget to love what you do. It sounds cheesy, but obviously you've got to work so hard and you've got to put in the hours, but you really can't lose sight of why we're doing it. And I think for me, just loving the chance to play music every day is probably the most important thing.
Phoebe, thank you so much for chatting. It was so great, and got to have you back for a round 2 and a round 3, and hopefully live in Australia, like what we were talking about. That would be super cool. So thank you, Phoebe, and thank you for listening to this. Maybe it's your first podcast of this podcast, or any podcast, I guess, could be ever, or maybe you've been along for these hundreds and hundreds of episodes over, I think it's 12 years at this point. Oh my goodness. Regardless, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. I know Phoebe appreciates it, and you're part of this bass community here. There are thousands of us in this community that listen to this podcast, and if you want to connect with that community, well, first of all, you can connect with me. I'm easy to get in touch with, though I might take a couple days to get back to you. Feedback@contrabassconversations.com will put you in touch with me, and I love hearing from people, and I get messages every day from people all over the world, and it's just so cool to hear what people are up to. But you can also connect with the broader community. We have a great Facebook group, Contrabass Conversations Facebook community. You can go to contrabassconversations.com/community or just search for us on Facebook. And there are great conversations happening every day there. And I go in and I look and someone asks, what kind of car should I get for my bass? And then you'll see 75 comments of all sorts of different things and pictures and great advice. I'm going to be flying. Let me know. What should I know about this or that? Looking for a special kind of bow. And so I know that you'll have a good time in there in between the podcasts. It's a great way to stay fully fueled up on bass geekery, I guess. I'd like to give a huge shout out to the team that puts this podcast together. Thank you so much to Trevor Jones, Mitch Mooring, Krista Copper, Steve Hinchy, and Michael Cooper. And if you're looking for a bass, Mitch makes a beautiful bass and does great work just east of Dallas, Texas. Look him up at mitchmooring.com. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.